Breach of Peace by Daniel Greene. So I've been watching Daniel Greene's videos for the past year or so now, and I generally appreciate the way that he approaches his reviews. While I often don't agree with his opinions, and we seem to have different tastes when it comes to science fiction and fantasy, I do appreciate the way that he looks at things like character development and world building. So naturally, I was very curious to read his work when he announced that he was putting out his own book. Unfortunately, I can't do a proper review here, because I'm going to start out with this opening disclaimer. I don't like detective fiction. There are certainly some exceptions, but in general, I'm just sick of seeing detective work. Particularly because so much science fiction and fantasy, when put into TV shows, just gets watered down into detective work that happens to have fantastical elements. You know, when you consider shows like Lucifer, which comes from the Sandman comics and is a very compelling character and has a lot of potential storytelling, and they reduced it to the devil is the sidekick of a detective and they solve mysteries together. And that's a very easy well to draw from. If you want to set up the characters to really throw them into the mystery, what better way to do so than by having them to be a detective who is investigating the mystery? Sometimes it's very lazy. Other times it's not. And I happen to think that the way Daniel Greene approached Breach of Peace, it's not lazy at all. But since mystery stories are not to my taste, I'm going to be very careful with how I word my review. And honestly, if this was pretty much any other author, I probably would not have picked it up based off of the premise alone, simply because I don't enjoy that kind of story, so why am I going to read it? But as an indie author myself, I am always very interested in what other indie authors do, especially with somebody who has quite a bit of success on YouTube criticizing and analyzing storytelling. And so for this first novella, which I believe is supposed to be the first of 3 novellas before leading into the series proper, I had very mixed feelings, which should be understandable considering I don't like detective fiction. It took me about halfway through the book before I really started enjoying it, because it was about halfway through the book before it started shifting a little bit away from the detective work and delving more into the depths of the plot. Or at least the plot in regards to the aspect that I would enjoy. And add on top of that the fact that I don't really read a lot of novellas, so I don't know if some of my criticisms necessarily apply, and they might not hold up when put as part of the trilogy that he has planned. But initially, just as a standalone book, I felt like he did a really good job with all of the characters. The 3 main characters are very interesting, very well realized, and I really appreciated the marriage between Khalid and Samuel. And I felt like Daniel did a really good job of realizing their relationship without having that really be the focus of the story. And as a whole, I felt like the plot was very well-rounded and very succinct and didn't really leave too many threads dangling at the end, other than leaving threads open for future stories. So in general, it was a very solid story, and I did appreciate it. I just really had to push through, especially the first half, just because, again, it's really not to my taste. I did have a few nitpicks with the prose. There were a few points that he threw out a random word that didn't really fit with the flow. Like, for instance, at one point he used the word dragoon, and I'm not entirely certain that the way he used it necessarily fit, but even if it did, it just didn't quite fit with the flow of the rest of the writing. But in general, I think Daniel Greene's prose was solid. And there were a couple of points where, a sentence here and there was a little bit clunky, and I definitely noticed it, so I would have reworded those. But aside from a few instances here and there, I really didn't have an issue with any of Daniel's prose, and in fact, I felt like his prose is pretty good. I've seen much worse in very successful books, so I can't hold it against Daniel for those few points here. And the one major issue I had with this book is, although the central plot is based entirely around something fantastical, in general, the story didn't really feel too much like a fantasy to me. And that might be the strong emphasis on the detective work, but up until the very end, there really wasn't that much that really gave me a strong sense that this was a fantasy world. He does sprinkle in tidbits here and there of world building that were interesting, but I didn't feel like it really drew me into the world that well. He has references to the Almighty, but I don't really get the strong sense that this is a God who is physically present in the world and is ruling over this empire, even though I know that to be the case from some of the ways that Daniel's have talked through his videos. Likewise, we don't really get very much about the Anointed until they appear right towards the end. And so in a lot of ways, this felt like an opening chapter of a story rather than an entire story in itself. Now, the story that Daniel presented here does wrap up within the pages of this book, but this feels more like the pilot episode of a TV show, which wraps up the first mystery, but the overall world you're not really getting explored much, you just get a base introduction to it. And so in that regard, I have mixed feelings about it. I feel like it does a decent job of telling its story, but it doesn't do the best job of really introducing us to the world. And so I would say that I don't really know enough about the world for me to have a strong desire to come back for more. And the other thing is, I've been reading Mistborn recently, and at least based off of what Daniel put forward here in this first novella, the way the Almighty and the Anointed are presented here feels very similar to the Lord Ruler and the Inquisitors. Now, as I already said, we don't get a lot of time or focus on it, so that may simply be my initial impressions. But based off of those initial impressions, it feels very much like the same thing as Mistborn, just with a different plot and a different setting. But overall, I felt like it was a very strong first novella, a very good first outing from a junior author. I am somewhat curious about the world that he's building, but I don't feel like there's enough here to really draw me in. If the next book is focused on detective work again, I probably won't read it, but based off of the way this story progressed, I don't think that's necessarily going to be the case. And if it's not, then I will definitely be picking up the next book. So I'm not really going to give a score or a specific opinion about whether the book is good or not, primarily because I don't like detective books. That being said, it is a solid book. So if you enjoyed Daniel Greene and if you're interested in reading a fantasy book that's a little bit off the beaten path, then I would say it's worth checking out. But if you've read the book, and especially if you like detective books, what did you think? I'm very curious to hear other opinions that might be a bit more open to this type of story. And do you feel that Daniel did a good enough job building up the world? Was there enough there to draw you in and bring you back for more? Do you agree or disagree with my comparison to Mistborn? Let me know down in the comments. I'm very curious to hear what you think. If you could help me out by hitting like, subscribe, do all that stuff, really appreciate it. And until next time, this is Uncle Joel saying, stay tangible.